There's no good way to tell someone their toddler might be haunted. Seriously, imagine being in a sleepy, post-war British village where the biggest scandal is someone forgetting to return a library book. And suddenly you're hearing rumors about ghost children playing hopscotch in their own old bodies. And not metaphorically. Literally. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And hey, post your local time and location in the comments. I love seeing where all you little night owls are watching from, especially if it's from somewhere spooky or scenic, or both. Now let's begin this story with two little girls, a garden, and a second chance at childhood that might have been more than anyone asked for. It's May of 1957 in Hexham, England, a quiet, cobblestone kind of place, where the milk bottles are still delivered by hand and kids play outside until dinner, because screen time hasn't been invented yet. Joanna Pollock is 11 years old. Her younger sister, Jacqueline, is 6. They are walking to church with a friend, holding hands, gossiping in that breathless, high-stakes way only kids can. When a car barrels around the corner, the car is driven by a woman who'd recently lost custody of her own children. Some reports later called her mentally disturbed, which in 1950s medical terms is about as precise as diagnosing someone with having vibes. Whatever her state of mind, she accelerates. She does not brake. And in a flash of screeching tires and panic, all 3 girls are hit. Only the driver survives. The entire town goes quiet for days. Not because they're cold, but because in this kind of community, grief doesn't need to shout. Everyone knew the Pollock girls. Joanna, clever and maternal. Jacqueline, mischievous and dramatic, always trying to keep up with her big sister. Now, just gone. Buried side by side in the local cemetery beneath a shared stone that's too small for such a massive absence, John and Florence Pollock, their parents, fall into a chasm. John, a devout Catholic turned spiritual philosopher, read the kind of guy who reads theology books for fun, becomes convinced this isn't the end. Not in the poetic, they live in our hearts way, but literally. He tells Florence he knows their daughters will return. Florence, who just wants to survive long enough to stop crying in the cereal aisle, is not thrilled about this. Don't say that, she tells him. You sound mad. I saw them, John says. In a vision. Right. Totally comforting. Here's a quirky detail for you. John isn't just relying on dreams. He starts reading every book on reincarnation he can get his hands on. Not easy in 1950s England, where most libraries are still trying to pretend the occult is a foreign problem. But John digs deep. He's obsessed with India's traditions of rebirth, Tibetan beliefs about soul migration, and yes, he even tries to correspond with monks, despite never having left Northumberland. He goes so far as to say, if we have more children, the girls will come back. Florence, to her credit, says something like, that's not how any of this works. John, but then she gets pregnant. And not just pregnant with twins. This is rare. She has no family history of twins. No fertility treatments unless you count praying at weird hours. Even her doctor looks like he might faint when he sees 2 little beans on the ultrasound, or, more accurately for 1958 guesses, based on measuring her belly and poking around like a confused fortune teller. Still, Florence carries them to term, and in October 1958, almost exactly a year after Joanna and Jacqueline's funeral, she gives birth to 2 girls, Jennifer and Jillian. Jillian is the older twin, just like Joanna was the older sister. Jennifer is the younger again, like Jacqueline. And then come the birthmarks. Jennifer, the younger twin, has a distinctive birthmark on her forehead, nearly identical to one Jacqueline had from a childhood fall into a bucket. Yes, a literal bucket. The 1950s were a lawless time, but that's not the weirdest one. She also has a dark, oval-shaped mark on her waist. The same mark, in the same spot, that Jacqueline had. This one was noted by doctors during Jennifer's newborn exam, because unlike dreams and vibes, Birthmarks are medical facts. At this point, Florence begins to quietly freak out. She doesn't tell John immediately, probably because she doesn't want him doing the reincarnation victory dance. But when the twins are a few months old, Florence starts noticing more eerie similarities, little gestures, posture, even their sleep positions. Jennifer sleeps curled tightly on her side, exactly like Jacqueline. Jillian spreads out diagonally, like she's trying to claim as much mattress real estate as possible, just like Joanna. Now, reincarnation stories aren't new. They show up across cultures from ancient Greece to Hindu philosophy, where the idea of samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, is central. Even Plato, in his sleep-deprived cave math way, had ideas about souls recycling. But in the mid-20th century UK, especially in a staunchly Catholic household, it's not exactly Sunday school material. Florence, the more traditional Catholic of the pair, struggles with this. Her faith says reincarnation doesn't happen. Her daughters, on the other hand, are saying something just not in words yet. But they're watching, observing, picking up cues they shouldn't understand. And then, around age 3, they start to speak. "Where's Mary?" Jennifer asks one day. Mary, who Florence says, "Mary, my doll, the one with the yellow dress." Here's the thing. Mary was Jacqueline's doll. Not just any doll. Either a handmade, one-of-a-kind doll with a stitched yellow dress that Florence had put into storage after the accident. The twins had never seen it. Florence goes cold. John, when he hears, goes suspiciously quiet in that trying not to say "I told you so" kind of way. But the avalanche has started, and it's not slowing down. The girls begin identifying toys, rooms, places, things they have no business knowing. They call their dead sisters playmates by name. They even request the same games. Florence starts journaling everything. She doesn't want to believe it, but she also doesn't want to forget anything. She writes down what they say, how they say it, and starts looking for patterns. Meanwhile, John is thriving. He's ordering books from India, writing letters to obscure philosophy professors. At one point, he claims the girls even react strongly to photos of the old family dog, who died before they were born. "I'm telling you," he says, standing in the living room with all the energy of a man who just cracked a cosmic riddle. "They are the girls." Florence is still not so sure, but when she hears Jennifer mutter, "That's where the car hit us," while pointing to a curb they'd never walked past before, well, even a good Catholic has to pause. The Pollocks, as a unit, were officially weird now. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. Weirdness, especially of the supernatural variety, tends to seep in like fog, quiet, persistent, and suddenly surrounding you when you thought it was just a bit chilly out. But there was no denying it anymore. Something uncanny was happening in that sleepy house in Hexham. Florence still tried to keep things normal, which in this case meant raising the twins like any other kids, with a healthy dose of stern British parenting, a lot of wool sweaters, and absolutely no acknowledgement of their possible ghost memories. Meanwhile, John leaned into it harder than a man playing charades with the afterlife. He was obsessed with parallels, watching the twins' behavior like a hawk, who also subscribed to Mystic Weekly. Joanna, the older daughter, had always been nurturing. She'd mother Jacqueline, tie her shoes, and once wrote a scathing letter to a neighborhood boy who called her sister Squinty. Jillian, the older twin, began doing the exact same things unsolicited, and often with a dramatic flair that suggested either past life memory or a future in regional theater. Jennifer, the younger twin, had more in common with Jacqueline than anyone wanted to admit. She was mischievous, prone to odd little tantrums, and showed a deep fondness for makeup, particularly pretend lipstick made from jam, which was apparently Jacqueline's favorite vice, too. Once, when Florence scolded her for it, Jennifer replied with, "You didn't used to mind when I did it before." Florence dropped the jar. That was becoming a theme. Offhand comments that sliced through the everyday. Casual declarations about memories the girls weren't supposed to have. like the time the twins were walking to the park and pointed out their old school along the way. They were only 3 and had never attended school, and yet they argued heatedly, like pint-sized realtors, that this building was not the correct one. "We went to the red one," Jennifer insisted. "It had a yard with that spinny thing." "You mean a roundabout?" Florence asked. "Yes, Jacqueline used to get sick on it. No one, not their parents, not the neighbors, not the bewildered postman who happened to overhear, had ever mentioned that to them. Now, some people believe kids just say weird things, and that's true. All children are, at heart, tiny surrealist poets with no filter. They tell you the moon is sad, or that your eyebrows are shaped like knives. But this wasn't the random nonsense of the preschool set. This was disturbingly specific. Florence began keeping a notebook. She didn't title it anything dramatic like Evidence of Reincarnation Volume 1, but the vibe was there. Inside were phrases like, said, "The big slide is gone now," referring to park that was rebuilt in '58. Jennifer upset about missing marbles. Florence had hidden them in attic post-accident. Jillian asked if old lady with the cat still lives across the street. She died in 1957. There were dozens of entries. Some made Florence cry, some made her shiver, and one made her start going to church twice as often. Jennifer said, "I remember dying." Pause here. That's not a normal thing for a 4-year-old to say. That's not even a thing a horror movie 4-year-old says without orchestral stabs and a flickering light bulb. She said it during breakfast, while buttering toast. No drama, no spookiness. Just, "I remember dying." It was loud. Florence went cold. John, of course, was delighted. He started pacing the kitchen, muttering about soul continuity and early life recall patterns, which, if you're wondering, is absolutely a phrase used in some reincarnation research. Dr. Ian Stevenson, who we'll meet later, uses it constantly in his cases. And here's a curious academic note: research into children's memories of past lives often shows a cutoff age. Most cases report the memories begin fading between ages 5 and 7. That matched what was beginning to happen in the Pollock household, too, but not before a few more unsettling episodes. One day, Florence was organizing old boxes in the attic, something she'd avoided for years. She hadn't touched Joanna or Jacqueline's belongings since the funeral. Now, with the twins playing outside, she thought she'd steel herself and get it over with. She opened the trunk. Inside were toys, a pair of scuffed shoes, and a collection of costume jewelry, cheap stuff, plastic beads and charm bracelets, tangled together in a little blue satin pouch. Florence turned it over in her hands and blinked. Downstairs, Jennifer screamed. Not a normal "I don't want a bath" scream. A piercing, panicked shriek that sent Florence thundering down the stairs. When she reached the living room, she found Jennifer curled up on the floor, sobbing and holding her waist. "It hurts," she said. The blood's there again." Florence was already dialing the doctor before the words fully registered. She was convinced something had ruptured, but the physician found nothing. Jennifer was physically fine, still. The girl kept pointing to her waist, the same spot where Jacqueline had a prominent scar from the accident. That's where the car had hit her first. It's worth noting that some researchers, especially in Eastern traditions, have long believed birthmarks and scars may reflect trauma from past lives. This is not accepted by mainstream science, but it's debated in certain corners of anthropology and metaphysical philosophy. You know, the fun dinner conversations. Florence didn't share this story with anyone for years, not because she didn't believe it, but because she did. And that was scarier. Meanwhile, the town of Hexham was beginning to talk. Quietly, Britishly. With pursed lips and knowing looks, the story of the twins was spreading, morphing as it went. Some neighbors were convinced the Pollocks were playing a twisted game. Others whispered about witchcraft. One woman even accused Florence of inviting darkness into her home, though she later apologized with a lemon drizzle cake. The local priest, Father Donnelly, took a more diplomatic approach. He told Florence the girls were simply grappling with inherited grief, and that their comments were probably unconscious echoes from overheard conversations. Florence, who hadn't spoken Joanna or Jacqueline's names in front of the twins for 4 years, politely disagreed. Then came the mirror incident. It was a quiet afternoon. Jillian had wandered into her parents' room and found the tall standing mirror one Florence had used while brushing Joanna's hair. Florence watched from the doorway as Jillian stared into it. After a long moment, she said, "I remember this mirror. It was taller before," Florence replied, gently. "You were smaller before." Jillian turned. "No, I wasn't." It was the way she said it, firm, calm, almost adult, like someone stating a fact in court. The mirror, the reflection, the eerie familiarity. It all settled over Florence, like a veil. Later that night, she wrote, "I am starting to believe things I never allowed myself to think." John Pollock was not the kind of man to let a supernatural incident go undocumented. If the twins were saying unsettling things about their past lives, he was going to log every ghostly utterance like an accountant during a paranormal audit. By now, his twin anomaly journal? Yes. He named it had grown thick with observations. He even added tabs. The man was building a case, not just to prove his daughters were reincarnated, but to offer the world what he genuinely believed was evidence of life beyond death. Or, as Florence once muttered over tea, a very dramatic sequel. In 1961, when the twins were around 3 years old, their awareness of the before time became even more detailed. They were more verbal now, chatty. Even, and that meant their memories, if that's what they were, began arriving in full paragraphs. One afternoon, John decided to test them. He dug through the attic again and found the box of Joanna and Jacqueline's old toys. Some were broken. Others were strangely pristine. He laid them out across the living room floor like an eerie toy yard sale. Then he brought the girls in and asked them to pick their favorites. Jennifer immediately grabbed a ragged doll with a missing eye. "This was mine," she said. "You fixed her once when her arm came off." Florence's mouth opened, then shut again. That doll had indeed lost an arm in 1956. It had been Jacqueline's. She'd cried for 2 days until Florence sewed it back on with mismatched thread and maternal resentment. Jillian picked up a toy pony with peeling paint and nuzzled it like an old friend. "I used to name her Sally," she whispered. John wrote it all down, heart pounding. The twins never called these toys by name before. He was sure they'd never even seen them. And then came the kicker. Jennifer walked over to Florence and asked, very seriously, "Where is the necklace I had when I died?" Florence dropped her tea, because that necklace, an amber-colored plastic pendant, had been buried with Jacqueline. They hadn't told anyone. It wasn't in the newspaper. It hadn't even been mentioned to John, who stood blinking like someone just unplugged him. So now we're beyond coincidence. Past lucky guesses. We're deep into the sort of territory where skeptical minds begin twitching nervously, which is fair. Any good mystery has to tangle with logic before it lets the weird win. Some psychologists propose that children like the Pollock twins are simply absorbing unconscious cues from parents. Maybe they overheard stories, or picked up on visual associations. Florence and John, after all, were still grieving. Perhaps they'd unknowingly transmitted information through gesture, routine, or tone of voice. It's a valid theory. It's also boring, and the twins kept saying things that didn't line up with it, like their conversations about the accident. At first, they were fragments. "It was loud," said Jennifer. "The car was black," said Jillian. "It was..." But eventually, they began referencing the event in ways that felt more like memory than storytelling. Once, while walking to the market, Jennifer suddenly froze. "This is where it happened," she said, eyes wide. They were nowhere near the actual location. "No," Jillian corrected. "It was the next corner, with the fence and the gate." She was right. That was the exact corner where Joanna and Jacqueline had been killed. Florence started crying in the middle of the high street, which confused the grocer, the butcher, and a passing postman who immediately told his wife everything and probably exaggerated a little. Post-war England had no Netflix, but it did have gossip. Later that week, the twins were playing dress-up when Florence overheard Gillian muttering, "I'm glad we don't have to go to heaven again." It was boring. Okay, let's pause there. Either these children had a cinematic imagination, or someone needed to call a philosopher. By this time, Florence had stopped trying to rationalize everything. She still went to Mass, still said her rosary, but she'd started wondering whether theology needed a footnote for reincarnation. Catholic doctrine strictly prohibits belief in it. According to official teachings, we die once, and then it's judgment time, no backsies. But what if there was something else, some rare exception, or a quirk in the cosmic system, a bureaucratic soul error, a heavenly copy-paste? Was it really so outrageous to imagine that something sacred might have slipped the red tape? She didn't say any of this out loud, but she started reading books she wouldn't have touched before. She borrowed one from the library and hid it behind a James Herriot novel, like a teenager sneaking a forbidden romance. Meanwhile, John was doing the opposite of hiding his interests. He was now corresponding with fringe researchers across Europe, including one group that believed souls followed bloodlines like overly dramatic stalkers. Another letter came from a French mystic who claimed the twins were a test case for karmic loop correction, which sounds like a yoga pose, but was apparently very serious. And amid all this, the girls just kept being them. One morning, Florence caught them arguing in the garden. "You always pick the best flowers," Gillian said, pouting. "Well, you always fall over and cry about it," Jennifer replied. "That's because I'm smaller." "No, you're not." "Yes, I was. When we died, I was smaller." They both went quiet. Then they looked at each other in perfect, eerie synchronization and burst into laughter. Florence stood by the window, watching, unsure whether to call a priest or a playwright. As for the town of Hexham, well, people were interested, in the same way people are interested when they peek through your curtains during an ambulance visit. Whispers circulated. Children were told not to ask the twins too many questions. Some parents even tried to stop their own kids from playing with them. "They've seen death," one woman muttered to another during choir rehearsal, as if that was contagious. Still, not everyone judged. A few neighbors believed the story outright. Others didn't, but liked having a little mystery in their otherwise beige lives. And some just enjoyed the spectacle. One particularly nosy old man took to calling them the haunted lassies whenever they passed, which Florence found extremely unhelpful. Through it all, John kept his notes, Florence kept her doubts, and the twins kept remembering, and then they didn't. Memories are funny things. Sometimes they're vivid, like watching a high-definition documentary inside your brain. Other times, they're more like a smudged watercolor painting, someone left out in the rain. For the Pollock twins, their memories of a previous life began to fade just as suddenly and as quietly as they'd arrived. It started slowly. Jennifer, once fiercely confident in her identity as the reincarnated Jacqueline, stopped referring to my other house and started calling it that place you talked about. Gillian, who could once recite the layout of rooms she'd allegedly lived in before, began confusing them with her current bedroom. Florence noticed the shift first during a breakfast when Gillian paused mid-sentence and said, "Wait, did I dream that, by the time they were 5, the references to Joanna and Jacqueline had mostly vanished? They no longer insisted the toys were theirs from a past life. They stopped asking about the accident. And the one time Florence mentioned their sisters just to see, Jennifer blinked, confused, and said, 'Who?' Florence went to the bathroom and cried. John, meanwhile, was completely unmoored. He'd built a personal theology around the twins' apparent reincarnation, complete with notebooks, theories, even diagrams that looked like they belonged in a spiritualist's PowerPoint presentation. He didn't know what to do with silence. Not eerie, haunting silence, but the kind that means the story's over and no one's giving an encore. He tried to prompt the girls, gently. "Do you remember the old house with the garden swing?" he asked one morning while tying Jillian's shoes. She shrugged. "Maybe I think I saw it in a dream." A dream. He wanted to shake her. Not in a bad way, but in a please remember you were supposed to be proof of the universe kind of way. This sudden forgetting was not uncommon in cases of alleged reincarnation. In fact, many cross-cultural studies, especially those stemming from Hindu and Buddhist traditions, note that children who recall past lives usually stop doing so by age 7. Researchers hypothesize that as the child's brain matures, new neural connections overwrite old ones, or maybe, as one Tibetan monk put it, this world becomes heavier than the last. But what made it harder for John and Florence was how complete the forgetting seemed. It wasn't a fading so much as a vanishing. Like the curtain didn't just close, it disappeared entirely. The girls moved on. They started school. Jillian became fixated on horses and began demanding riding lessons. Jennifer developed an obsession with space and told everyone she was going to marry the moon. She drew little wedding invitations and everything. One said dress code sparkles only. Sparkles. To anyone else, they were just normal children. Slightly eccentric. Slightly too clever. But normal. Florence, for a while, tried to ask them subtle questions, nudging gently, hoping to keep the thread alive. But the responses she got were vague at best. Dismissive, at worst. "What are you talking about?" Jennifer once asked, frowning. "That's a weird thing to say." Mum. So Florence stopped asking. John didn't. He took to reading his journals out loud at night to himself, mostly. Sometimes to the girls, who would giggle or yawn or ask if they could please go watch TV instead. Once, he read the entry about the time Jennifer described dying. It was loud, she'd said. So seriously. He reread it like scripture. But Jennifer just stared at him. Blank. "I don't remember that," she said. "Was I being funny?" "No," he whispered. "You were being you. There's a philosophical debate buried in here, like a big old onion of the soul if someone forgets who they were. Are they still that person if Jennifer no longer recalls Jacqueline's trauma? Does it mean the soul has moved on? Or does it mean the entire case was never real? To begin with, just a complex web of grief, suggestion, and toddler weirdness. These questions haunt not just the Pollocks, but the researchers who later studied them. Because this isn't just a spooky story, it's a real one. The names are real. The places are real. And the uncertainty. That's the realest part of all. Florence eventually packed up the notebooks, not with any ceremony. Just one afternoon, while the girls were at school. She gathered everything: John's notes, her own journals, the news clippings, even a toy or two, and put them in a box labeled old stuff. Then she shoved it under the bed. Years later, she would describe this period as when life started happening again. It didn't mean the mystery was over. It just meant it stopped being the center of their lives. There was laundry to fold, teachers to call, sandwiches to pack. The twins grew up and became people not proof. Still, the past clung to them in odd little ways. Jennifer remained deeply empathetic, sensitive to other people's moods, quick to comfort. Jillian often dreamed in vivid detail, sometimes waking up with a sense of déjà vu so strong it made her cry. They never linked it to Joanna and Jacqueline again, but Florence sometimes wondered. Then there was the time, at age 8, when Jillian was looking through an old family photo album and paused at a picture of Joanna. She stared for a long time. "Who's this?" "That was your sister," Florence said. "Careful." Jillian frowned. "She looks like me." Florence nodded. Jillian tilted her head. "She looks like how I feel when I wear the red jumper." "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Just like I'm not me." Florence didn't say anything. She didn't ask more. She just closed the photo album and made tea. "There's a quirky detail for you. John once tried to have the girls hypnotized. He read about regression therapy and thought maybe, just maybe, they could access their past selves again. But the hypnotist he contacted refused. "I don't hypnotize children," the man said, "especially not haunted ones." So that was that. The girls grew. The house stayed quiet, and the mystery began to settle into its final form, a memory about memories. A story about a story. Something half-remembered, like a dream you're sure was important, but can't explain at breakfast. John never stopped believing. Florence never stopped wondering. And the girls, they just became themselves. The dolls were the first clue something wasn't quite right. Not spooky, not paranormal, just odd. The kind of thing that sits in the back of your mind, like a splinter. You're not sure how you got. It started with Mary, the doll. Not the person, though, if you're keeping track of names and souls at home. There may not be much of a difference. Mary was Jacqueline's favorite toy before the accident. Handmade, soft-bodied, with a yellow dress and a faint, permanent jam stain on her tiny fabric foot. Florence had packed her away in a box after the funeral. She couldn't bear to look at it. But Jennifer found it. She was 4, poking through the attic like all future horror protagonists, and came stumbling down with the doll under her arm, grinning like she'd just uncovered buried treasure. "This is Mary," she said. "She's still here." Florence froze. Mary had never been mentioned in front of the twins. Not by name, not by description, not even vaguely as the yellow one. But Jennifer knew. She cradled the doll exactly the way Jacqueline had, even fussed at the frayed hem of the dress the same way, and she was furious when Florence tried to take it from her. "She's mine," she shouted. "You always try to hide her." Not exactly the kind of thing you want screamed in your face by a child who might be a reincarnated ghost. Florence let her keep it. What else could she do? Later that day, she found Jillian muttering to herself in the garden, walking in a slow circle around the flower bed. When asked what she was doing, she answered matter-of-factly, "Trying to remember where we buried our treasure." "What treasure?" "The one we hid before the car came." No treasure was ever found. But for weeks afterward, the twins insisted they had once buried a metal tin beneath the lilac bush. John, of course, got a shovel. No tin, no anything, except startled worms and Florence yelling that the neighbors were staring again. These moments piled up like a stack of eerie postcards from a place no one could visit. Sometimes it was a toy, sometimes a smell. Jennifer once recoiled from the scent of tar on the road and began crying. "It's the black stuff." She sobbed. "It smells like when the pain started." Jillian, on the other hand, had a more complex relationship with memory. She didn't react as dramatically, but sometimes she'd say things in passing that landed with the weight of a dropped piano. Like the time she wandered into the kitchen and asked, "Do you think the car saw us?" Florence dropped the plate she was washing. "What? The car? Did it see us before it hit?" Florence sat down and didn't get back up for a long time. Let's take a quick breather for an actual, peer-reviewed academic detail. According to some reincarnation researchers, they exist. One of the markers of past life memory in children is phobia without cause. Specifically, extreme, unexplained fear of things related to the alleged former death. And wouldn't you know it, Jennifer hated roads, with a passion, couldn't cross one without screaming. Even parking lots were a battleground. Florence tried exposure therapy. John tried prayers. Neither worked. Until one day, just before her 6th birthday. Jennifer stood at the curb, took a deep breath, and crossed the street. No scream, no hesitation, just crossed. Florence almost passed out. Later, Jennifer said she didn't know why she'd been scared in the first place. John wrote that down in his notebook with trembling hands. Then he drew a little check mark next to it, as if that meant something had been completed. But there were still other boxes waiting to be checked. One of the stranger episodes occurred on a windy Sunday afternoon. The family was going through old photos, Florence trying to organize, John trying to re-experience, and the twins were helping, sort of. Mostly they were making funny faces and demanding biscuits. Until Jillian held up a picture of Joanna at age 10. "This is me," she said. "No, that's your sister," Florence corrected gently. Jillian shook her head. "No, it's me. I remember wearing that skirt. I spilled juice on it." The photo was taken the day Joanna had spilled orange juice on herself. No one else knew that. Florence hadn't even remembered it until that moment. But there was a faint stain, right where Jillian pointed. Jennifer, not to be outdone, found a picture of Jacqueline and said, "That's when I had the bump on my chin." She did, in the photo. A bruise from falling in the schoolyard. Again, nothing that had ever been shown to the twins. Florence sat back, dazed. John nearly dislocated something from nodding so hard. He was sure now. The girls weren't just similar. They were the same, which led to the next phase of his obsession trying to test them. He became like a game show host of the metaphysical. He'd set out objects and ask the girls to name them. He'd ask if they remembered certain streets, people, or pets. Sometimes they answered correctly. Sometimes they didn't. And sometimes they'd give him a look like, "Why are you asking us that?" One day, after another one of his experiments, Jennifer said quietly, "Why do you always want us to be the other girls?" John didn't have an answer. Because here's the twist: the girls were beginning to pull away. Not just from their parents, but from the past. They started correcting Florence and John more often. "No, I don't remember that. No, that's not my doll. Stop saying I'm like her." By age 7, the references had dwindled. Mary the doll was just a doll again. The memories had become foggy. Sometimes they even denied them outright. And the house felt emptier for it, not because the ghostly presence was gone, but because it never said goodbye. It was around the time the girls started school that things got complicated, not in a haunting, levitating furniture kind of way, just the ordinary, socially inconvenient way that happens when your kids start telling other people about their previous deaths. On Jillian and Jennifer's first day at the local primary, Florence gave them the usual pep talk. Be kind. Listen to your teacher. Don't eat glue. What she didn't cover, because why would she, was don't tell your classmates you used to be dead. That memo did not arrive in time. According to one mortified teacher's note, Jennifer had calmly informed a girl during finger painting that she used to go here already, before I was Jennifer. When pressed, she elaborated, "I died, and now I'm back. So technically, I should be in year 3. The other child cried. The teacher, Mrs. Holden, a brisk, cardiganed woman with strong opinions on sensible shoes, requested a meeting. She said it so, matter-of-factly. Mrs. Holden told Florence, adjusting her glasses like they might deflect spiritual possession. As if it were just geography, like she'd moved towns, not planes of existence. Florence apologized profusely. She blamed it on overhearing grown-up conversations and imaginative nonsense, which wasn't technically a lie, just elastic truth. But the incident sparked something else, a string of similar comments, muttered between lessons, whispered during lunch. Jennifer and Jillian spoke of our other mummy. Of that time we were bigger. And once, horrifyingly, when the blood came, parents began whispering. One mother accused Florence of exposing the girls to the occult. Another said she'd read about a family like this in a magazine, right before it caught fire mysteriously. John, of course, was thrilled. This is documentation, he told Florence, who was not amused. We have eyewitness accounts from outside the family now. Florence just wanted a week without being side-eyed at the grocer's. Still, the twins weren't trying to be dramatic. They weren't telling stories for attention. They spoke about their alleged pasts the way one might mention a dream or a memory from last summer. Jillian once referred to a former pet, a black spaniel named Flossie, who had belonged to Joanna. No one had talked about Flossie in years. But Jillian described her bark, her torn ear, even her favorite sleeping spot under the radiator. And then, without missing a beat, she asked, "Can we get another dog? That one's gone now." The teachers, to their credit, handled things as best they could. One suggested the girls were using imaginary backstories to cope with the stress of twinship, a term Florence later repeated mockingly while drinking wine straight from the bottle. John responded by mailing that teacher a 14-page letter titled Reincarnation in Western Children, a Forgotten Science. She did not reply. But then something happened that even Florence couldn't explain away. It was art day at school. The assignment was simple: draw your house. Most kids drew rectangles with chimneys and lollipop trees. Jennifer, however, drew a building no one recognized. Red brick, 2 stories, with a white door and ivy creeping up the left side. Jillian drew the exact same house from a different angle, complete with a side garden and a worn fence. The teacher assumed it was an invented fantasy, until she showed Florence. Florence went pale. That was the family's old house, the one they lived in before the accident, before moving to a new neighborhood to start fresh. The twins had never been there, never seen pictures, never heard stories. And yet, they'd drawn it in precise, matched detail, like a pair of eerie architectural interns. Maybe someone told them about it, the teacher suggested, more hopeful than convinced. Florence didn't argue, but she added another note to her mental catalog of the unexplainable. That night, she asked the girls, casually, "Do you remember that house?" "Of course," said Jillian. "It was our favorite." Jennifer nodded. "That's where we played the quiet game when Mummy was sad." Florence felt her stomach twist. That had been a thing. After the accident, she'd often sat in the living room crying silently, while Joanna and Jacqueline invented the quiet game to cheer her up without making noise. She had never told a soul. Still, as the months passed, the girls' strange comments began to decrease. They started focusing more on cartoons than on reincarnation. Jillian became obsessed with ponies. Jennifer wanted to be an astronaut and/or a sandwich. They were still unusual. Jennifer refused to sleep without Mary the doll next to her, even when Mary had lost both arms and most of her face, but they seemed to be settling into this life more than clinging to the last. But then came the game. One rainy Saturday, the twins were playing indoors, reenacting some kind of dramatic family drama with sock puppets and a weirdly aggressive cardboard lion. John was sitting nearby, pretending not to eavesdrop, until he heard Jillian say, "No, Jacqueline, don't go in the road." Jennifer paused, then, in a flat, chilling tone, replied, "But I have to get my book." John nearly fell out of his chair. The conversation stopped there. The lion attacked a sock. The moment was over. But for John, it wasn't, because Jacqueline had gone into the road for a book. She'd dropped it getting out of the car and darted back just as the other girl shouted. It was never in the police report, not in the newspapers. John had told no one, except Florence. Later, when he told her what he'd heard, she just said, "Maybe they just know more than we do." That night, John reopened his journals. He began copying all the entries into a new binder labeled Public Draft. He was preparing to submit the story, somehow, somewhere. Someone had to take it seriously. Florence didn't stop him, but she also didn't help. She was tired. The kind of bone-deep tired that comes not just from grief, but from years of doubt, years of questions without answers, and children who might or might not be echoes of the ones you lost. And then, one evening as she tucked Jennifer into bed, the little girl yawned and asked, "Mummy, do you think when we die again, we'll come back as cats?" Florence paused. "I hope not," she said. "I'm allergic." Jennifer laughed, snuggled into the blanket, and fell asleep. And for the first time in years, Florence didn't dream of ghosts. You can get used to almost anything, given enough time. Leaky ceilings, screaming foxes in the backyard, children who may or may not be reboots of your previous children. It's just human nature. But every so often, the weirdness flared back up like a rash with a taste for dramatic timing. That's what happened the day the twins described the accident again, but this time with cinematic flair and unsettling precision. They were 7. The weather had turned damp and moody, as it tends to do in Hexham. The kind of gray day that makes you question whether the sun was ever real. The twins were playing in the sitting room, while Florence folded laundry nearby, half listening, as parents do. Jennifer was drawing. Gillian was narrating a story out loud in a sing-song voice, and then the car came fast. And it was too late to run. Florence froze. Jennifer chimed in. "You screamed first. Then I fell. Then we were sleepy," Gillian added, nodding. Florence looked up. "Sleepy," she said. "Yeah," said Jennifer, frowning thoughtfully. "Everything got fuzzy. And I remember floating, like a balloon," said Gillian, helpfully. Florence stood very still, one sock clutched in her hand, like it was the only thing tethering her to the here and now. These weren't fragments. These weren't slip-ups or guesses. These were narrative arcs. The twins were essentially workshopping the screenplay of their own past deaths. The thing is, they didn't seem upset. They weren't traumatized by the memories. They were calm. Peaceful, even. Like kids retelling a bedtime story they'd heard too many times, but still liked. But Florence was shaken. She later wrote, "It's like they carry it, but don't fear it. I envy them." That night, she told John what the girls had said. He nearly wept. "This is it," he said. "This is our breakthrough. Their full past life recollection is developing." Florence, sipping tea at the table like someone who'd fought in too many spiritual wars, gave him a look that translated roughly to, "Please stop trying to sell me an epiphany when I'm just trying to survive breakfast." But John wouldn't stop. He insisted they record everything the girls said, audio tapes, transcripts, hand-drawn maps of where the twins said they'd been hit. Florence agreed. Reluctantly, the next day, they sat the twins down and gently asked them to describe what they remembered. And suddenly, nothing. "Oh, we were just playing," Gillian said, swinging her legs. "We make up stories all the time." Jennifer nodded. "Yeah, that was pretend. But yesterday," John said carefully, "you said you remembered floating after the car hit you." "Did I?" Jennifer shrugged. "I don't know. That sounds silly." Florence watched John's face crumble. His moment of truth, neatly dodged by 2 kids who now claimed it was just playtime imagination. But here's the thing. Maybe it wasn't a dodge. Maybe it was the truth. Or maybe it was the twins' subconscious way of putting a lid on something too big to hold forever. Either way, the memories, the statements, the vivid moments started appearing less and less. But that didn't stop other people from noticing. At school, the girls had developed a reputation. Some classmates were enchanted. Others avoided them entirely, whispering behind hands about the dead twins and daring each other to sit near them during lunch. A few especially theatrical children insisted the girls could read minds or summon ghosts, which, for the record, they never actually claimed. Once, during a school assembly, a boy fell and hit his head. He was fine, but Gillian reportedly ran over and whispered, "You'll be okay." I remember that pain. Florence got a phone call from the headmistress that afternoon. "She's a lovely girl," the headmistress said, clearly trying not to say, but terrifying. And that's when Florence realized something uncomfortable, even if the twins forgot. The world wouldn't. The story was out there now. It had become part of their identity, whether they wanted it or not. She worried for them. What would it be like, growing up in the long, weird shadow of your alleged former selves? At home, they'd mostly stopped talking about Joanna and Jacqueline. At school, they were trying to be normal. But the echoes lingered. One evening, Florence walked past the bathroom and saw Jennifer staring into the mirror, not brushing her teeth, not playing, just staring. For minutes, when asked what she was doing, Jennifer replied, "Trying to remember my other face." Florence said nothing, just hugged her, then left the room and cried silently into a towel. And the dreams those hadn't stopped. Jennifer had nightmares once a week, usually involving cars, screeching, the color red. Once, she woke up shouting, "Don't let go of my hand." When Florence calmed her, Jennifer asked if she could sleep in her parents' bed. "I had that dream again," she said. "The one where we're both on the ground and I can't get up, and Jillian's not talking." Florence pulled her close and whispered, "It's not real." And Jennifer replied, in the smallest voice it was, "There's a philosophical debate here. Of course, memory versus imagination, reincarnation versus repetition compulsion. Carl Jung might have had a field day with the Pollock twins. Are these patterns archetypes or legitimate cross-lifetime connections? Or maybe kids just pick up more than we think." Florence didn't have an answer, but she kept the towel by her bed. Meanwhile, John began sending his notes to experts, not journalists, academics. He wanted to be taken seriously. He contacted parapsychologists, philosophers, even clergy who were rumored to be open-minded. Most replied with polite rejections. A few ghosted him entirely, pun very much intended. But one man in Virginia read everything and didn't laugh. His name was Dr. Ian Stevenson, and he was about to change everything. Dr. Ian Stevenson was not your typical paranormal enthusiast. He didn't wear flowing robes or introduce himself as the Oracle of Rebirth. He was a professor, a psychiatrist, a buttoned-up, academically grounded man with an unfortunate mustache and the serene intensity of someone who kept his pens alphabetized. He also happened to be the world's leading authority on children who remember past lives. While most reincarnation conversations took place in the realms of mysticism, incense, and enthusiastic crystal retailers, Stevenson was collecting data, thousands of pages, hundreds of cases. His office at the University of Virginia reportedly looked less like a ghost hunter's lair and more like the inside of a filing cabinet having an existential crisis. When John Pollock's package arrived, a stack of notes, timelines, twin behavior reports, and Florence's quietly heartbreaking journal entries, Stevenson was intrigued. He wrote back, requesting an interview. John nearly fainted from joy. Florence, hearing about it over toast, replied with, "Oh good, let's all tell our dead children's story to a stranger from Virginia." But she agreed, because if anyone could bring clarity to this whole ordeal, it was this soft-spoken scientist with a niche interest in metaphysical recycling. So, in 1964, Dr. Stevenson arrived in Hexham with a suitcase, a tape recorder, and a face that looked like it had never once told a joke. He met the family in their modest sitting room and spent hours interviewing everyone: John, Florence, Jillian, Jennifer, even neighbors who remembered Joanna and Jacqueline. He wasn't flashy. He didn't bring a Ouija board. He just asked questions. Lots of them. What did the girls remember? When did the memories start? Were there photos around the house? Could the parents have unknowingly influenced the children? John answered with certainty. No photos. No stories. We kept everything hidden after the accident, Florence added. We didn't want to scare them. They were babies. We tried to move on. Stevenson made careful notes. He was looking for patterns, parallels, slips in logic. But again and again, he found consistent testimony. He was particularly fascinated by the birthmarks. Jennifer's marks, one on her forehead, another on her waist, matched injuries sustained by Jacqueline in the fatal crash. Birthmarks had been reported in other cases, but rarely with such anatomical precision. Stevenson, being the scientific type, included a hand-drawn diagram in his files. It looked like a child's treasure map, but with arrows pointing to ghost wounds. He also noted that the girls had described their previous lives in a way consistent with his other subjects' early onset between ages 2 to 4, fading memories by age 7, a sense of emotional carryover, like fear of roads, and unlearned knowledge. The infamous Mary the Doll incident made his eyebrow twitch with professional interest. Now, to be fair, Stevenson was biased. He'd spent years trying to prove that consciousness could survive bodily death. But he was meticulous. He interviewed skeptics. He checked police reports. He verified timelines. And he ultimately categorized the Pollock case as one of the strongest Western examples of possible reincarnation on record. Let that sink in. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a Reddit thread or a story told by someone who swears their cousin met a talking ghost baby at a pub. This was a case, filed, footnoted, and peer-reviewed, sort of. Of course, not everyone agreed. Skeptics argued that John had likely influenced the girls, even unconsciously, that children are impressionable, that memory is malleable, and that the Pollocks had suffered a trauma so profound it reshaped how their family processed reality. A few psychologists theorized that Florence, despite her efforts, had given subtle cues. The children pick up on emotion, body language, even the tension behind a spoken name. Others pointed to confirmation bias, how the twins' correct memories were remembered and recorded, while mistakes or forgettable moments were ignored. To his credit, Stevenson acknowledged all of that. In his notes, he wrote, "The case is compelling, but not definitive. It requires further study and cautious interpretation." And that's the thing, even the guy trying to prove reincarnation wouldn't say, "Yes, reborn. Stamp it." Which kind of makes the story even creepier, doesn't it? Because in the absence of certainty, the mystery only deepens. After Stevenson's visit, John felt vindicated. He proudly referenced Case 44, the number Stevenson assigned to their file, any time someone rolled their eyes at him. Florence, however, was less enthused. She didn't want her daughters turned into science exhibits or spiritual mascots. And by now, the girls were aging out of their eerie stage. They were more interested in boy bands and roller skates than ghost memories. Still, Stevenson's visit left a mark. For one thing, it reignited questions the family had quietly shelved. And for another, it meant other researchers started paying attention. Letters arrived, some from scholars, some from people claiming to be soul intuitives. One offered to hypnotize the girls remotely, using cosmic tuning forks and radio waves. Florence threw that one in the bin. But a few correspondents made Florence pause. One woman, in neat handwriting, described losing a child in a car crash and dreaming vividly, repeatedly, that her daughter was on her way back. Another wrote that her twin boys often talked about the other fire, and when we used to be sisters. Some letters were heartbreaking, others were unhinged. One just said, "I remember the trenches. The rats know me." Okay. But for Florence, there was a strange kind of comfort in it. They weren't alone. Whatever this was, miracle, delusion, cosmic glitch, they weren't the only ones dancing with it. And the girls, they rolled their eyes whenever the topic came up. Not the dead sisters again. Gillian groaned one evening while trying to do homework. Jennifer chimed in. "Can we be haunted less and grounded more? Please." They were moving on. Living. Their past life had faded into background noise, still there, still humming, but no longer steering the ship. Stevenson would later reflect that this fading was part of the pattern, that maybe these memories were never meant to stick, that perhaps they were just transition data bits of the old code bleeding into a new program before the system rebooted fully. Florence wasn't sure. John remained absolutely certain. And Stevenson, he closed the file, labeled it, and slid it into a drawer alongside dozens of others. Another mystery in a sea of mysteries. Another set of questions waiting for the next child, the next story, the next impossible thread to tug on. Time is funny. It softens things. Sharp grief becomes a dull ache. Vivid memories start to feel like stories you heard instead of lived. And if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on the day, you get to keep going. That's what happened to the Pollock twins. By the time they reached adolescence, the strange things they'd once said were folded neatly into the family's history, like old letters in a drawer. No one really talked about them anymore. Not the dolls, not the dreams, not the time Jennifer said she remembered her own funeral and then asked what color coffin she'd had. Pine, Florence had whispered, like she was cursing furniture. Now, Jennifer was into astronomy and chewing gum with the casual intensity of a teenage iconoclast. Jillian had taken to collecting horse figurines and practicing how to roll her eyes with maximum disdain. In short, the past was out. Eyeshadow and existential mood swings were in. But even if they weren't talking about their alleged past lives anymore, that didn't mean the echoes had disappeared completely. There was one particular dream. Jennifer began having it around age 12. She never talked about it directly, not at first, but Florence would find her sitting up in bed afterward, pale and quiet. It was the hill again, she finally admitted one morning over toast. What hill? The one with the tree. The thin one. I was falling toward it. Florence blinked. There had been a hill near the crash site, a small rise with a lone tree. She remembered John yelling about it at one point, saying, "That's where Joanna's bag landed during one of his less subtle detective phases." Florence hadn't thought about that tree in years. Was I there, she asked. Jennifer shrugged. Not really. I don't think anyone was. Just the feeling of before. The feeling of before. There's a term in psychology for that creeping sense of misplaced familiarity, jamais vu, the opposite of déjà vu. When something you know feels suddenly alien. But what Jennifer described wasn't quite that. It was more like emotional residue, like her subconscious still knew a story her waking mind had moved past. She'd have that dream 3 more times that year. And then, never again. By now, the girls were in secondary school. New haircuts, new slang. Jennifer had a brief interest in goth poetry. Jillian flirted with vegetarianism until someone explained she'd have to give up sausage rolls. They were normal teens. Mostly, every so often, something strange would slip out, like Jennifer's irrational fear of buses, or Jillian's quiet insistence that she didn't like Wednesdays because they feel sharp. One time, during a sleepover, a friend jokingly asked, "What were you in your past life?" Jennifer deadpanned, squished. Everyone laughed. But Florence, listening from the hallway, didn't. John, meanwhile, still gave interviews. Stevenson's book had included their case, Case 44, and now John received letters from strangers, journalists, and the occasional Swedish philosophy student who believed souls traveled in IKEA furniture. He didn't mind the attention. He'd become a kind of local oracle. People would nod respectfully at him in the high street, whispering things like, "There's the man whose daughters came back from the dead." Lovely rhubarb. That one. Florence remained private. She didn't deny what had happened, but she no longer offered commentary. It was real, or it wasn't. We lived it either way. She once told a reporter who tried to ambush her with a camera crew and a very excited psychic. She shut the door in their faces after offering them biscuits, because manners. As for the twins, they entered the long tunnel of adolescence, and then emerged, inexplicably, as adults. Jillian pursued art. She liked to paint landscapes, trees, fences, roads that curved just out of sight. Jennifer went into healthcare. She said it made her feel useful, alive. She once joked, to no one in particular. Neither one mentioned Joanna or Jacqueline again, but there were traces. Jennifer kept Mary, the ragged doll, in a shoebox under her bed. She never said why. Jillian avoided the old neighborhood. When asked, she just said, "Bad vibes." And one day, during a casual family dinner, Florence brought up something from Joanna's childhood, just a passing anecdote about a scraped knee and a stubborn dog, and Jennifer went very still. "I remember that," she said. "You were there?" John asked, eyes lighting up like it was 1962 again. Jennifer shook her head. "No, it just feels like I was." And that's how it was. Not a grand revelation. No dramatic flashbacks or sudden unlockings of cosmic memory. Just feeling. Like a song you forgot you knew the lyrics to until someone hums the first bar. The academic debate raged on. Some researchers still pointed to the case as proof. Others called it coincidence. A few wrote essays arguing that John, despite his enthusiasm, had likely influenced the girls through subtle cues, body language, emotional weight, bedtime stories he didn't even realize he'd told. But none of them could explain the birthmarks, or the toys, or the fact that 2 girls, with no exposure to their sister's belongings, had named them, claimed them, and grieved for a life they shouldn't have known. That was the part everyone kept coming back to. Even years later, when the case had been cited in books, debates, and at least one mildly offensive TV dramatization, the question remained. How did they know what they knew? Maybe they didn't. Maybe grief is contagious, and memory is a group project more than we think. Or maybe the twins really were two lives picking up where the first had been violently cut short. In the words of Dr. Stevenson himself, we do not need to believe to be curious, but we must be curious if we want to understand. Florence once said something similar, though less elegantly. I stop trying to solve it. I just try to respect it. A pause. And sometimes I duck when I cross the road, just in case. Florence Pollock had a secret, not a scandalous one. Not the kind that would have made her the star of a true crime documentary or earned her a dramatic church whisper. No, this was something quieter, stranger. The kind of secret you keep not out of guilt, but because saying it out loud would make the world tilt slightly in a direction you're not sure you can handle. She started seeing things just after the accident. It began with dreams simple at first, the kind that fade by morning. Joanna and Jacqueline in fields, laughing, running, always out of reach. But then, Florence noticed something. The girls in her dreams aged. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Aged. Each dream. They were slightly taller, a little older. She watched them grow in her sleep as if some hidden part of her was still tracking time on their behalf. By the time the twins were born, the girls in Florence's dreams looked exactly their age, down to the way Jacqueline's gap-toothed smile mirrored Jennifer's. Florence didn't tell John, because John would have turned it into a thesis, a sacred sign, another notch in his metaphysical tally, and this, whatever this was, felt personal, tender, fragile. But it wasn't just the dreams. One afternoon, not long after Jennifer and Jillian turned 5, Florence was folding laundry when she heard humming. A tune she hadn't heard in years, one Joanna used to sing while brushing her doll's hair. She turned, expecting one of the twins behind her. No one. The house was empty. The tune stopped the second she stood up. Another time. She was gardening and swore she saw 2 children run past the hedges. Same height, same strawberry blonde hair. But when she called out, only Jennifer came running. You called, she asked. I thought I saw you. Must have been Jillian, Jennifer said. She's sneaky. But Jillian had been inside the whole time, drawing a rocket ship that, according to her, was powered by glitter and breadsticks. It wasn't constant. It wasn't terrifying. It was intermittent hauntology, if you will. Little ripples in reality that made Florence question her own grip on grief. So she went to the priest. Father Donnelly was a kind man, older than God, always smelled vaguely of mint and theological guilt. She didn't tell him everything, just that she was worried and seeing signs. He said something priestly and unhelpful like, God moves in mysterious ways, and so must we, which might work on someone who hadn't just seen her dead child peek around the stairs before disappearing again. Still, he tried. He came to bless the house, said prayers in each room. Jennifer sneezed during the incense and declared that it smelled like spicy sadness. Jillian asked if the holy water would help her guinea pig, who'd been looking emotionally distant lately. Afterwards, Father Donnelly gave Florence a small silver cross and told her to keep it nearby. She did, but the dreams continued. In one, the girls sat by a river, talking, not playing, talking like adults, about what happened and what's next. In the dream, Florence asked if they were okay. Joanna looked up and said, We weren't done yet. Then she woke up, and then there was the night Florence saw them in the hallway. She wasn't asleep. She was walking to the bathroom, barefoot, half asleep. And there, at the end of the corridor, stood 2 girls identical in height, posture, silhouette. But not Jennifer and Jillian. She knew the difference. A mother always knows. They looked at her, smiled, and faded like mist at dawn. Florence didn't scream. She just stood there for a long time, the tiles cold beneath her feet, wondering whether grief had finally decided to get theatrical. She didn't tell John, not right away, but eventually. During a rare moment of calm rain tapping the windows. Girls asleep. John reading, she said, "I've been seeing them." He lowered his book. The twins. The other ones. He didn't laugh. He didn't say anything. Then, after a long pause, he said, "So have I. That broke something open. They talked for hours. About the dreams, the glimpses, the unexplainable things. How Jillian once described an imaginary friend who wore a pinafore with jam on it. Jacqueline's exact favorite dress. How Jennifer had, during a tantrum, shouted, 'You never listened to me the first time I was your daughter.' They'd both kept their experiences quiet, assuming the other wouldn't understand. But now, in the quiet safety of candlelight and shared fear, they realized they were still living with all 4 girls. 2 in the world, 2 in the walls. Florence still struggled with Catholic guilt. The idea of reincarnation didn't sit neatly with her beliefs. She'd once asked Father Donnelly directly, "Is it possible?" He'd replied, "I can't speak for God's accounting methods, but I know love doesn't always follow rules," which was the most Catholic non-answer of all time. So Florence made peace with not knowing. Maybe the dreams were real. Maybe the hallway ghosts were grief echoes. Maybe Jennifer and Jillian had been vessels for something more. Or maybe kids are just weird and unpredictable. But she knew what she'd seen, what she'd felt, and then she told the girls. They were 12 now, old enough to understand. So Florence sat them down and told them about Joanna and Jacqueline. Not as myth, not as a theory, just as their sisters, who had once laughed, once lived, and who had possibly come back through them. The girls listened, wide-eyed. They didn't interrupt. When Florence finished, Jillian said, "That makes sense." Jennifer added, "It's like I knew, but forgot I knew." Florence cried, hugged them both. Let the moment breathe. And then Jennifer asked, "Do ghosts get tired?" Florence blinked. "Why? Because I think they're done watching us now." Florence didn't sleep that night, but not out of fear, out of peace. Dr. Ian Stevenson had many peculiar habits, most of them acceptable in a professor, mildly worrying in anyone else. For instance, he kept his notes in color-coded binders with names like verified strong cases and suspect, but interesting. He also had a rule that he wouldn't investigate a case unless at least 2 independent witnesses could corroborate a child's past life statements. But when it came to the Pollock twins, he made exceptions. The evidence was too rich, too strange, too British. After his first visit to Hexham, Stevenson didn't just archive the Pollocks and move on. He followed up, sent letters, asked for updates. At one point, he requested handwriting samples, because of a theory, admittedly fringe, that reincarnated souls may display similar penmanship. Florence obliged, though she wrote a cheeky note on Jennifer's apologies if this soul writes in crayon. But Stevenson wasn't just interested in spooky anecdotes. He was trying to build a scientific case for something that, by all traditional Western logic, shouldn't exist. And he was looking for patterns. He found them. The Pollock file case 44 became one of his most referenced cases, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so ordinary. No seances, no levitations, just a middle-class family, 2 uncanny children, and a string of memories no one could quite explain. He published articles, gave lectures, described the twins' matching birthmarks, the toy identifications, the inexplicable phobias, the timeline of forgetting. And he pointed out one detail that had mostly gone unnoticed. Jennifer, the younger twin, who allegedly reincarnated as Jacqueline, often deferred to Jillian even though they were born minutes apart. Just like Jacqueline had deferred to Joanna, the older sibling in the original pair. It seemed small, but it stuck with him. That kind of behavioral echo is harder to fake than words. he told a colleague. Of course, not everyone was impressed. The academic debate surrounding Stevenson's work was less collegial disagreement and more verbal knife fight in a philosophy cafe. Some called him a pioneer, others a quack with a publishing deal. A particularly brutal review in a psychology journal referred to him as well-meaning, but tragically credulous. Another called his work a collection of bedtime stories with footnotes. Stevenson, ever the gentleman, wrote a polite rebuttal that used the phrase respectfully unmoored from intellectual rigor, which is academic for Sir. I challenge you to a duel using passive aggression. But he didn't back down, because for every eye roll he got, he also received letters from parents. Hundreds of them. Stories like the Pollocks, sometimes eerier. He even developed a theory bold, controversial, and probably drafted after 3 espressos and a long stare into the abyss that souls might choose their returns. Not always, not consciously, but with some strange gravity of unfinished business, a spiritual algorithm, a karmic nudge. He cited Jennifer and Gillian as a possible example. Perhaps they were drawn back, not by choice, he wrote, but by orbit. The pull of a family not ready to let go. John Pollock, for the record, loved this theory. He began referring to the twins as our orbiting stars, which Florence found both poetic and insufferably smug. By now, the twins were teenagers, bright, moody, opinionated. Their interest in the reincarnation story ranged from amused eye rolls to outright embarrassment. Gillian once snapped, "Stop telling people I'm a dead girl with horse art. I have layers." "Mum." Jennifer leaned into the weirdness more. She claimed she didn't remember being Jacqueline, but admitted sometimes she felt like she was sharing space, like a really polite roommate. She explained, "She doesn't talk. She just leaves feelings around." Florence wasn't sure what that meant, but it haunted her. Stevenson, meanwhile, made one last visit. It was 1968. The twins were 10, old enough to answer questions thoughtfully, young enough to still believe in their own imagination. He sat with them in the garden, notebooks ready, tape recorder humming. They were polite, vague, slightly bored. "What do you remember from before you were born?" he asked. Gillian shrugged. "Not much now. I think I dreamed it." Jennifer added, "Sometimes I feel like something's missing, but not in a sad way." Stevenson scribbled furiously. Later, in his notes, he wrote, "Memories appear to have faded completely. However, behavioral patterns persist. Emotional resonance remains strong." He asked them if they believed they were their sisters. Jennifer paused. "I think maybe we were." Gillian shook her head. "I think we're us." It was, in a way, the perfect answer. Stevenson flew home and filed the last of the Pollock documents in his archives. Over time, he would go on to collect over 2,500 theosophic cases of alleged reincarnation from around the world. He remained controversial, respected, dismissed, and adored in roughly equal measure. But Case 44 stayed special, because unlike so many others, it never asked to be extraordinary. It just was. Years later, his assistants would say that whenever he wanted to explain the mystery of consciousness, not prove it, not define it, just point to it, he'd pull out the Pollock file. A quiet case, in a quiet town, with a story that, no matter how many times you tell it, still refuses to settle. And back in Hexham, life went on. Florence kept a shoebox of mementos under her bed, photos of all 4 girls, little drawings, a broken doll's arm. She never opened it, but she never threw it away. John died first, peacefully, dreaming, probably of diagrams and notebooks and celestial flowcharts. Florence lived longer, quieter, wiser in a way that can't be taught. She never remarried. She never stopped setting 4 places at the table during holidays. And sometimes, if you passed by the house at dusk, you'd swear you could hear laughter. 2 sets, distinct, blending, echoing like old music in a new room. The twins were 15 when they finally asked the big question, not to Florence, or John, or even each other, but to themselves, separately, on the same day. which is exactly the sort of thing that happens when your whole existence is already a footnote in a supernatural case file. It started with Jennifer. She was lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling, when the thought arrived, uninvited. What if we were just borrowed? She didn't say anything to anyone, just sat with it. Meanwhile, across the hallway, Jillian was sketching a horse because of course she was, and had a jolt of thought so sudden she dropped her pencil. What if we're not them at all, but they're still inside us? At dinner that night, the conversation went from "How was school?" to "Do you think we're ghosts with homework?" in about 5 minutes. Florence nearly choked on a potato. "Why now?" she asked. "Recovering. Because we're starting to feel like ourselves," Jillian said. "Like properly. Not someone else's rerun." Jennifer nodded. "But we still feel connected. Just less haunted. Like the lights are off in that room. But we know where the switch is." Florence blinked. John, if he'd been there, would have immediately launched into a monologue about soul continuity and karmic data transfers. But he wasn't. And Florence didn't feel like channeling his ghost, even if he'd probably love that idea. Instead, she said the only thing that felt honest. "I think maybe you can be more than one person, especially when the world needs you to be." And that became a kind of family mantra, a catch-all, the spiritual equivalent of shrugging with reverence. By this point, the twins had stopped attracting attention. They weren't the reincarnated girls anymore, just Jillian and Jennifer. They had friends, exams, teenage dramas. Jillian had a crush on someone in her art class who looked like he'd fallen out of a Joy Division album cover. Jennifer went through a phase where she dressed exclusively in silver and declared she was post-human. They still got the occasional awkward question a neighbor would ask. "Do you remember that thing from before with the gleam of someone desperate for a supernatural fix?" Jennifer once replied, deadpan, "Yeah, I remember being Cleopatra's dog." The neighbor did not ask again. But in private, the questions persisted. One night, while watching a storm roll over the moors, Jennifer said, "Do you think we were supposed to fix something, like what Jillian asked?" "I don't know. A mistake. A gap. Like, we were brought back to finish a sentence that got cut off. It was a poetic idea, and maybe more than that. There's an ongoing philosophical debate, yes, even in actual academic circles about what it means for a soul, if such a thing exists, to return. Is it continuity of identity? Is it an essence, a pattern, a flicker of light in a different bulb? Or is it memory, emotion, a grief so loud it echoes forward? The Pollock twins never claimed to be Joanna and Jacqueline. Not really. They said strange things. They remembered impossible details. But as they aged, they began to understand something deeper. They weren't carbon copies. They were echoes. Carriers of unfinished love. The human equivalent of a page resumed after being ripped in half. Jillian once put it like this: "We're not them, but without them, we wouldn't be us." Which, frankly, could go on a t-shirt. By age 16, the memories had stopped entirely. Or maybe, more accurately, merged. The way a dream slips into your day without you noticing. The girls no longer spoke about the accident, no longer claimed ownership of toys from lives they technically shouldn't remember. But they still visited the graves. Every year, on the anniversary, without prompting, they'd bring flowers, sometimes wild ones, sometimes store-bought because they were teenagers and busy. They never cried, never said much, just sat by the stones. "One year," Jillian whispered. "Thanks for letting us borrow your lives." Jennifer said, "We'll take good care of this one." Florence never asked what they said. She just waited in the car, hands on the wheel, staring at the road where everything had changed. And then came the interview request. A London-based documentary crew wanted to feature them in a special titled, "The Ghosts Who Grew Up, Where Are They Now?" Florence said absolutely not. Jennifer said maybe. Jillian asked if they'd be doing hair and makeup. Eventually, they agreed with conditions. No dramatization, no creepy music, No spooky reenactments with glowing twins staring into mirrors. The interviewer asked all the expected questions. What do you remember? Do you believe in reincarnation? Do you feel like one person or two? Jennifer replied. Depends on the day, Jillian added. We're just people who had a weird beginning. Everyone does, really. It aired on a Thursday night. The ratings were decent. One critic called it gently unsettling, like if BBC did The X-Files with fewer guns. After that, the letters started again. Fewer this time. Mostly kind. People thanking them. People telling their own strange stories. One woman wrote, I lost my daughter, and then my granddaughter was born with her dimple and the same stubborn tantrums. Maybe you've given me permission to believe it's her. Florence cried, reading that one. But the twins were done with being case studies. They wanted lives, uncomplicated ones, or, at the very least, ones that weren't always asked to answer for death. So they stopped doing interviews. Jennifer went on to study nursing. Jillian became a landscape painter. They moved out, got their own flats. They stayed close, but they no longer shared that invisible thread of memory in the same way. They'd grown into themselves, but on quiet days, when the rain tapped just right on the windows, Jennifer still heard the old tune, the one Joanna used to hum. Not a memory, not a ghost, just a feeling. The twins turned 21 with little fanfare, unless you count the unexpected toast delivered by their Uncle Bernard, who'd had too many sherries and raised a glass to the reincarnated rascals. Jennifer choked on her sparkling water. Jillian muttered something about changing her name to Not That Twin, but by then, most of the mystique had faded, or, more accurately, been smothered under layers of adult life, bills, flatmates, soggy commutes, and the soul-crushing horror of assembling IKEA furniture without divine intervention. Still, every so often, the past poked its head up like a groundhog with unfinished business. Jennifer once received a letter. No return address. Just a single sentence. Do you remember the red sweater and the hill? She never told anyone. She burned it in a cereal bowl using a candle and the wrong end of a spoon. The flat smelled like toasted wax and mystery for a week. Meanwhile, Jillian had her own moments. Once, while walking through a gallery in Edinburgh, she stopped dead in front of a painting. It wasn't particularly famous, just a quiet landscape, two children playing by a tree. But it hit her, like a punch to the ribs. She knew that tree. She remembered that tree. She asked the curator where the painting had been based. He said, oh, just outside Hexham. I believe. The artist lived there, painted local spots. She didn't sleep that night. Neither twin spoke about it, though, not because they didn't care, but because the language around it had eroded. There's only so many times you can say, I think I used to be dead, before it starts to feel like a punchline you're tired of hearing. Still, the subject lingered. In the corners of rooms, in the spaces between questions. Like Jillian once said, it's like I'm not haunted anymore. But the floorboards still creak sometimes. That creaking grew louder when they returned to Hexham for a funeral. Not a parent, not a relative, just Mrs. Holden, their primary school teacher, the one who'd handled their reincarnation era with the quiet panic of someone trying to babysit a haunted doll and pass an Ofsted inspection at the same time. They hadn't seen her in years, but at the service, people nodded politely, side-eyed them, and whispered, "That's them. Isn't it, the... You know." Jennifer resisted the urge to wear sunglasses indoors and say, "We don't do autographs." Afterward, they visited the graves. The grass was longer than usual, the stones mossy. Still there, side by side, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock. Born. Died. That was it. The girls stood in silence. Finally, Jillian said, "Do you feel anything?" Jennifer replied, "Yes, but it's mine now." And that, really, was the point. They weren't haunted. They weren't possessed. They were just people who'd once been children who said strange things and made the world uncomfortable with the possibility that not everything ends when it ends. But the academic debate, oh, it was alive and thriving. By the 1980s, the Pollock case had been cited in dozens of publications. Not just Stevenson's, psychology, theology, parapsychology, philosophy, even one particularly ambitious undergraduate thesis titled Soul Twins and Time Loops, an analysis of identity through the Pollock lens. Florence received a copy. She used it to level the washing machine. Some researchers were fascinated by the behavioral consistencies. Others said the memories could have been the result of cryptomnesia, a term that basically means you forgot you heard something before and think it's your original thought, like humming a tune and swearing you made it up, only to realize it's jingle bells. Critics of the case pointed to the fact that John was such a believer, that maybe he'd unconsciously shaped the girl's environment, that the power of suggestion can be massive, especially in young, impressionable minds. But then there were the things no one could explain, the birthmarks, the doll identifications, the correct naming of unseen toys, the fear of roads before they could understand what fear was, the house layouts described in detail, the red sweater. Too much for coincidence, too little for proof. Florence, before she passed, was interviewed one last time by a gentle-voiced radio host with a fondness for mystery and tea cakes. She was in her 80s by then, sharp as ever. Still kept the box of notes under her bed. "Do you believe it was reincarnation?" the host asked. Florence smiled, slow and warm. "I believe it was something. Maybe not the something we think, but something kind. Something unfinished. Would you do anything differently? I'd have believed them sooner, and I'd have told them not to carry it so hard. Being strange when you're little is a heavy thing. Do you still dream of them?" "Not anymore, but I still set out 4 cups of tea sometimes. Habit." That was her last public word on the matter. She passed in her sleep the following year. Her obituary made no mention of twins or ghost theories. It simply said she was a beloved mother to Gillian and Jennifer, and remembered fondly by all who knew her, which, let's be honest, is a pretty classy way to go out. Gillian and Jennifer didn't attend the funeral together, scheduling conflict. Long story, but both brought wildflowers and both, without consulting the other, left a small white stone on Joanna and Jacqueline's graves. Neither knew the other had done it, because even now, decades on, they still shared some kind of rhythm, something deeper than memory, less spooky than destiny. Maybe just a tether made of love and weird beginnings. They don't talk about the before anymore, but sometimes, on long walks, when the air is still and the trees rustle in that specific, whispery way, Jennifer will turn to Gillian and say, "Do you ever get the feeling we've been here before?" And Gillian will reply, "Probably. Let's not mess it up this time." The town of Hexham eventually forgot. Not entirely. Of course, small towns never forget entirely. They just reorganize their weird stories into background noise, like old tin signs or garden gnomes that have been around so long, no one questions them anymore. The Pollock twins became part of that category, filed mentally somewhere between the time a cow escaped into the post office and the vague legend of a haunted well. Locals would still occasionally mention them, but mostly in that roundabout, hedging sort of way that implies belief without commitment. You remember the Pollock girls, the unusual ones? Oh, aye, the ones with the, what was it? Echoes. They live in the city now. Nice girls. Smart. Bit odd. But in a sweet way. It had been decades since the twins were referred to as anything other than themselves. No more references to being the returned children or those dead girls who came back for a sequel. They were grown, independent, and crucially unwilling to participate in anyone else's idea of their story. Jennifer lived near Manchester, worked in hospice care, calm hands, steady voice, the kind of nurse who could make even death feel like a well-written chapter closing quietly. Gillian moved to the coast, painted wild, abstract landscapes with streaks of color that sometimes looked like roads, sometimes like rivers, and sometimes like faces if you squinted just right. They visited each other often, never lived together, and rarely discussed the past. But then, one day, in a very unremarkable cafe in Newcastle, an elderly man approached them. "You're the twins," he said, not unkindly, just certain. Gillian gave him a polite smile. "Yes, but probably not the ones you're thinking of." He nodded. "Still, I remember your sisters. They were lovely." Jennifer, sipping tea, said, "They still are." The man smiled and walked away. Neither spoke for a while. Then Gillian said, "Do you ever think we're still being studied?" Jennifer raised an eyebrow. "Like, by ghosts? Or by the Reincarnation police?" "No, I mean by the universe." Jennifer leaned back. "Well, if we are, I hope it's learning something. We've been very cooperative." They laughed. But the truth lingered beneath the joke. Because while the world had mostly forgotten the Pollock twins' strange beginning, the twins themselves hadn't. Not really. It had just settled, like silt at the bottom of a lake. Still there. Just not active. And here's the thing about being part of a mystery that refuses to resolve itself. You start seeing it everywhere. Jennifer often noticed odd things at work. Patients in their final days would sometimes speak in past tense riddles. One old woman, moments before passing, said, "Tell them I'll take the hill path this time." Jennifer wrote it down. She didn't know who them was, but she felt it. Gillian painted a series she never exhibited. 15 canvases, each one titled after a moment she didn't remember living. She called the series Memory Noise. The last canvas was completely blank, except for a small red dot in the lower corner. When asked about it, she just said, "Some endings are really just punctuation." But the public had moved on. The Pollock case was now a curiosity on the fringes of the internet. A Wikipedia page, a few video essays, a late-night podcast episode sandwiched between haunted dolls and cursed lighthouses. Some viewers believed, some didn't. One commenter wrote, "This just proves parents will say anything for attention. Dead kids or not." Jennifer saw that one. Didn't respond. But she did set down her tea with just a little more force than usual. Gillian sent her a meme the next day that said, "Reincarnation, the original reboot." They still joked. That was their way. But privately, both knew the story still mattered. Just not in the way people expected. It wasn't about proving anything, or convincing skeptics, or solving a puzzle. It was about what happens when grief refuses to be linear. When love tries to finish something that death interrupted. When one life collapses, and impossibly, something new rises in its place carrying pieces of the old. In an unpublished letter, Stevenson wrote near the end of his life. He said, "If we are to believe in anything beyond this life, let it be not in return, but in remembrance that carries forward in living form." He sent that letter to Florence. She never responded, but she kept it. Framed it, actually, in a small dusty frame tucked behind the family photos on her bookshelf. She said it was a nice sentiment, whether or not it's true. And now the twins were almost 50. Time had softened even their strangest memories into something textured, not faded, just comfortable. Like an old coat you don't wear anymore but still keep by the door. Jennifer still worked with people at the edge of life. Still heard strange things from patients with glassy eyes and half-open mouths. Once, a man grabbed her wrist and whispered, "Tell her I made it to the other side." Which side, she asked. He smiled. Both. Then he died. She wrote that one down, too. Gillian still painted. Still refused interviews. Once, a curious grad student sent her a long questionnaire about the metaphysics of soul continuity. She replied with a single sentence, "I don't owe anyone an ending." In her early 50s, Gillian took a mirror off the wall, not because it was broken, not because she'd seen anything unusual in it, but because one day, she walked past, glanced at her reflection, and didn't recognize herself not in a sad, aging way, but in a fundamental dislocation. like her face had slid slightly out of alignment with the version of herself she expected to see. She wrapped the mirror in a towel, leaned it against the wardrobe, and left it there for months. Jennifer noticed when she visited. "Minimalist now," she asked, pointing to the blank wall. Jillian shrugged. "Too many reflections. Not enough clarity." Jennifer didn't press. She just unpacked her overnight bag and set a worn paperback on the nightstand. It was The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis Florence's old copy. The pages crackled like dried leaves. That night, they drank tea and talked about nothing for a while. Then Jennifer said, "Sometimes I feel like we dreamed the whole thing." Jillian nodded. "But we didn't." "No, we didn't." They sipped. The room was quiet. Then Jillian asked something she never had before. "Do you ever wonder if they're still here?" Jennifer didn't answer immediately. "Not in the haunting sense," Jillian added quickly. "Just in the way rain is still in the air, even when it stops falling." Jennifer smiled faintly. "Sometimes I think we were just the second half of a sentence, or a comma. Yeah, not an ending. There's a soft beauty in that kind of thinking. Not resolution, not proof, just texture. Something layered. Bittersweet. A life that contains another life without needing to prove it with facts and footnotes." They went to bed early that night. They both slept well. In the morning, Jillian took the mirror back out. Not to hang it, but just to look. To check in. To see which version of herself was showing up today. She saw the lines in her face. The memory of childhood still clinging around the eyes. But no flicker. No shadow. No ghost standing behind her. Just her. Still here. She smiled. That afternoon, they drove to the old neighborhood one last time. Not because they wanted answers, those had expired years ago, but because the weather was nice, and the bakery still made the best raspberry tarts this side of Reincarnation. They walked slowly, looked at the houses, the streets, the road. The curb where it all changed still had a crack Jillian remembered, though not from this life. Jennifer noticed the same thing, but didn't say it out loud. Some things don't need repeating. They're just shared. Before they left, they walked by the cemetery. Joanna and Jacqueline's headstone had weathered over the years. Jillian brushed a leaf off it. Jennifer whispered something so soft, even the wind couldn't hear it. Then they walked away. Neither looked back. Back in town, the bakery had a new cashier who didn't recognize them. Just two middle-aged women buying tarts. No one whispered. No one pointed. It was perfect. In later years, Jillian's art became abstract again. Color fields, soft edges. Occasionally a circle tucked into the corner like a punctuation mark. She never titled them after people. Only places. Places she might have been, or maybe dreamed of. The line had long since blurred. Jennifer eventually left healthcare and taught part-time. She liked the routine. She liked helping young people figure out how to ask questions they didn't have language for yet. She still visited Jillian often. They still drank tea and said things that sounded like riddles. They still crossed roads carefully, just in case. And when asked, occasionally, by the rare curious soul, "Do you still believe you lived before?" they had different answers. Jennifer would say, "I believe in echoes." Jillian would say, "I believe in remembering." And both would smile in that quiet way people do when they've lived through something too strange to explain, but too personal to forget. As time passed, the world moved on. The Pollock twins became a case study in textbooks, then a footnote, then a curiosity, and finally, a bedtime story. You might hear it one night told softly, between the rustle of blankets and the hum of a fan. A story about two sisters who died, and maybe came back, and maybe taught us that grief isn't just about endings. It's about what continues. Maybe you'll wonder if it's real. Maybe it is. Maybe it doesn't matter. Because in the end, whether they were proof of reincarnation or just a beautiful accident of memory, Jillian and Jennifer lived a life that mattered. A life made of questions, of echoes, of love that refused to vanish. And somewhere just outside the corner of your eye, there might still be two little girls in matching coats, walking hand in hand through a quiet street, looking for something they already found.